Good afternoon and welcome to Freud's final home at 20 Maresfield Gardens. I'm Keith Barrett, and this is the second half of the talk on Michel Foucault, which we began yesterday. I apologize for the slightly late start. We had some technical problems in the building just now, which we've overcome, fortunately. I'm sorry about that. We'll carry on for some extra 5 or 10 minutes at the end to make up the time that we've lost, so we apologize for that. Okay, so yesterday I gave an introduction to Foucault, and I talked about his first monumental work, History of Madness. And what I was particularly aiming to do was to explain what he says about Freud in that work, how he sees Freud. And I hope I managed to clarify that at the end of the session yesterday when we looked at his comments in History of Madness on Freud in relation to 19th century psychiatry. So yesterday we were looking at History of Madness, which means we were looking at Foucault's presentation of the history of psychiatry, and we mentioned social psychiatry because Foucault focuses on medical psychiatry and doesn't actually mention social psychiatry. And I made the remark that he could have written the conclusions to the book slightly differently if he'd taken into account the fact that there is such a thing as social psychiatry. There isn't just medical psychiatry, there is social psychiatry as well. And someone asked if one could recommend some reading on social psychiatry. So we're going to give you some titles, just a very brief list of some titles on social psychiatry, if you'd like those. We're going to put them in the chat, I think. Yeah, we're going to put them in the chat. 3 or 4 titles on social psychiatry. So please regard that as a supplement to the reading list. Okay, so that's History of Madness, which we looked at yesterday. Today I want to look at History of Sexuality, which is very, very different to History of Madness. To begin with, it's a much, much shorter work than History of Madness. Also, it represents a later stage of Foucault's thinking, written in the mid-70s, very shortly after Discipline and Punish, which represents a kind of new beginning, really, in Foucault's work. Discipline and Punish is the work in which power moves really to the center of his thinking. I mean, power is not in the center in History of Madness. I mean, power comes into History of Madness because he is talking about the power of the doctor in the asylum, for example. And it's an objection. The argument of History of Madness is an objection to the power of doctors, the objection that an objection to the power that medical psychiatry gives to doctors. But power hasn't moved into the center of Foucault's theorizing in History of Madness, which it does in Discipline and Punish. And this is displayed to the full in History of Sexuality. So we need to look at, just very briefly, at the new ideas in Discipline and Punish before we move on to History of Sexuality, I think. So I've given you some material for that. Once again, I've taken a brief selection from the book by Gary Gutting. This is called French Philosophy in the 20th Century. So it's a survey of French philosophy in the 20th century. It has a chapter on Foucault, and he reviews all Foucault's major works. And very helpfully, he gives a 1 or 2 page summary of the highlight points of each of the major works, and we looked at the highlight points on History of Madness yesterday. If you go to page 81 and 82 in the course textbook, there you'll find the highlight points from Discipline and Punish. So maybe if we start there, that will be a good idea. Okay, once again, please send in comments, questions, observations, anything you like as we go along, as this helps me enormously. Yesterday there were quite a few comments, for which I was very grateful, but they mainly came in the second half of the talk. In the first half of the talk, there were hardly any comments at all, and in the first half I felt a little bit lost. I didn't really know what I was going or where I was doing, because there was a complete absence of comments. And in the second half, it kind of picked up a bit, because based on what people were saying, I could get a sense of, yes, this is where I need to go. So please do send in your comments, questions, and observations. And start doing that as soon as you like. Okay, let us begin then with a brief look at Discipline and Punish, which I think was published in 1975. So I'm on page 81 in the course book. Okay, so with Surveye e Punia, so you notice the title Surveye e Punia, surveye meaning to survey. It's survey in the sense of surveillance. That's the relevant sense here, and punia, to punish. So the book is about a new kind of society that emerges in the modern period. And Foucault sees this new society very much as a surveillance society, a society in which we're all under surveillance. And that's the meaning of the title, Surveye e Punia. This fits in with Foucault's earlier work. You'll remember in History of Madness, we have the basic historical story. He looks at three distinct periods in History of Madness. In 1650, the medieval and Renaissance periods end, and the classical period begins, and the classical period runs up to the end of the 18th century. Then from the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, you have the beginning of the modern period. In Discipline and Punish, he's looking at the same historical schema, and he begins by looking at punishment and the way punishment works in medieval society and in the classical period, and the way punishment changes with the beginning of the modern period. And the focus of the book is on the modern period, and what the idea that emerges from his analysis is that we have to think about a completely new kind of power emerging with the beginnings of modern society in the 19th century. He develops this idea of a new kind of power. This was referred to yesterday. There was a question which said, can you talk about Foucault's idea of power as active? It's actually the idea of power as productive. That's the term he uses. And he makes a contrast between traditional monarchical power or sovereign power, which comes down from the top, and the sovereign basically prevents you from doing things or stops you doing things and basically punishes you very savagely if you do things that you've been forbidden to do. The difference between that kind of power, sovereign power, and the power that operates in the modern period is that modern power, which he calls disciplinary power, is productive. Foucault says it's not about kind of stopping people doing things, punishing them when they do things they're not supposed to do. Disciplinary power produces individuals who police themselves, essentially. This is what Foucault is saying. It's a new kind of power that emerges with modern society. This is the theme of Discipline and Punish. And this is what makes Discipline and Punish such an important book, because the idea is so powerfully argued that you end up with a completely different way of thinking about modern society. And that leads into history of sexuality, which we're going to look at today. Okay, let me go back to the piece by Gutting. He says, with Discipline and Punish, Foucault's work returns to the explicitly ethical motivations of history of madness, but now with a firm sense of how to incorporate causal accounts of changes in knowledge systems. I mean, I was making this point yesterday by saying that in his works of the mid-60s, he's got this idea of different paradigms succeeding one another. He uses the word episteme, really, but I'm using the word paradigm. But with his new thinking in the early 70s, he works out a way of explaining how this is caused, what the causation is that produces a shift from one episteme or paradigm to another. And this is where power comes in. Power is the explanatory factor. His particular focus is the emergence of the modern discipline of criminology and other related social scientific disciplines. With about Nietzsche, he characterizes his new approach as genealogical. The general idea is hardly original, that shifts in the power structures of society produce changes in epistemic formations. What is new is his understanding of the nature of power and of the precise way in which power and knowledge are related. Okay, so I'm going to go down to the foot of that column, the left-hand column in 81. He maintains that knowledge simply does not exist in complete independence of power, that the deployment of knowledge and the deployment of power are simultaneous from the beginning. Okay, so that's the idea we're going to explore. You'll see how he develops that that form of analysis in the history of sexuality. I'm going over to the right-hand side of 81 now at the top. His positive view is that systems of knowledge, although expressing objective and perhaps even universally valid truth in their own right, are nonetheless always more or less closely tied to the regimes of power that exist within a given society. Conversely, regimes of power necessarily give rise to bodies of knowledge about the objects they control. So power and knowledge are linked together now, Foucault. And going down to the next paragraph. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault treats knowledge, power, with respect to the connection between the disciplinary practices used to control human bodies in the modern period and modern social scientific disciplines. Okay. So he's looking at the connection between, on the one hand, the disciplinary practices used to control human bodies in the modern period, that is power, the connection between that and the modern social scientific disciplines, i.e. knowledge. Okay, so they're going to be shown to be linked, essentially linked together. His primary example is the practice of imprisonment as a way of punishing criminals in its relation to criminology and related social scientific disciplines. But he discusses imprisonment in the context of modern disciplinary practices in general, as employed in schools, factories, the military, and so on. And he shows how the prison served as a model and center of diffusion for this whole range of disciplinary practices. So what he's saying is that something new emerges with the prison as prisons are developed in the early 19th century. Just in the way, in History of Badness, he looks at the asylum as something new, and the way this emerges at the beginning of the 19th century, and then the consequences of that. In Discipline and Punish, he looks at the emergence of the prison in its modern form. Okay, as always, Foucault begins by contrasting the modern age with the classical age immediately preceding. He notes that the most essential and striking difference between the two periods was the violent and flamboyantly public nature of the punishment of criminals in the pre-modern period, in contrast to the physically much milder and low-profile modern punishment of imprisonment. Okay. Specifically, he explores the idea that punishment becomes milder not simply for the sake of mildness, but for the sake of a new, more effective and more extensive form of control. Again, this is Foucault's essential twist that he gives things, isn't it? Just as in History of Madness, when he looks at the asylum at the beginning of the 19th century, the mad are freed from their chains. I mean, they'd been chained up in the 18th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, the mad are freed from the chains, and this has always been seen as a big step forward in humanitarianism, a new, much more human way of treating people suffering from serious mental disorders. Foucault doesn't see it that way. He thinks that when the mad were released from their chains, they were just subjected to a far worse form of imprisonment, namely what he calls a gigantic moral imprisonment. They were subject to reform. You know, they were going to be brought into line with bourgeois morality. They were going to be reformed as moral individuals, and Foucault sees that as far worse than being kind of chained up in a dungeon somewhere. Similarly, with the birth of the prison, when he's talking about prisons, we would normally see this as a step forward in humanitarianism. So this being a much more humanitarian form of punishment. But Foucault doesn't see it that way. He sees there being a kind of new form of power emerging here, which is in fact, well, a more effective and more extreme form of control. In fact, that's what Foucault sees as emerging here. Okay, let's go on. Going on to sheet 82. In Foucault's account, modern discipline is distinctive in three ways. First, its object of control is not primarily the mind, thoughts, feelings, and so on, but the body itself. Second, its scale of operation is not a general control of the body as a whole, but a control in detail exercised on specific corporeal mechanisms. Thirdly, its modality of control is to focus not simply on the results of bodily activity, by seeing that one way or another people do what is desired, but to maintain a constant supervision and control of the processes of bodily activity. It's that last point which is going to be crucial for his analysis of sexuality when we come to that. Modern discipline is implemented through three distinctive techniques, he argues. The basic technique is hierarchical observation, careful monitoring by observers who are not themselves observed. Such observation lays the groundwork for normalizing judgment. Now, this is really the key to the whole thing. The technique of hierarchical observation, careful monitoring by observers who are not themselves observed. Such observation lays the groundwork for normalizing judgment. An assessment of the deficiencies of those disciplines that is directed not towards punishment for the sake of revenge, as in the pre-modern age, but to reform of deviant behavior. Modern reformist judgment situates individuals in a system of evaluation that pronounces them normal or abnormal. So this is the thing, you see, normalization becomes kind of a medium mechanism of power. Normalization becomes a primary instrument of modern power, he's saying. And he cites Foucault cites Bentham's panopticon design as an ideal model of how modern disciplinary power controls through its normalizing gaze. We'll have a look at the panopticon, which is one of the central passages in Discipline and Punish, in just a moment. But let me finish this these pages first. Although modern disciplinary practices originated in isolated, enclosed institutions such as prisons and asylums, they rapidly spread throughout society to schools, factories, medical clinics, welfare agencies, and so on. Detached from particular institutions, the practices also fell under the control of the nation state and exerted their influence on society as a whole. The general result was the transformation of society from one of violent spectacle to one of insidious surveillance. Okay. Okay. I'm just going to take one more section from this on the right-hand side of 82. If you go to about halfway down, he talks about the new law of the norm, which is the basis of modern power. Norms are determined by senators or judges. Sorry, they're not determined by senators or judges, but by psychiatrists, criminologists, social workers, and teachers. These accordingly become the de facto authorities in society. And when we move on to the history of sexuality, of course, it's the doctors and scientists who create the sciences of sexuality who are the important people here. Their authority, of course, itself derives from the authority of the social sciences of which they're the trained representatives. The carceral system of modern power is symbiotically related to the system of social scientific knowledge. See, that's the knowledge-power relation. The power system's techniques of observation and documentation are essential conditions for the development of the knowledge system, and the knowledge system provides legitimation for the power system's exercise of authority. Okay, to make this a little bit more concrete, let's look at the panopticon. Now, I've given you some sheets on this. Just let me find it. This is on pages, yeah, this is on, if you go to page 90 in the course booklet, this is from the book by Schwann and Shapiro, which is a commentary on Discipline and Punish. This is how they summarize what Foucault says about the panopticon. So I'm on page 90, I'm on the right-hand side, about a third of the way down. Foucault now turns to describe English utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham's plan for a privatized prison, panopticon, or the inspection house. This is 1787. In this, Bentham described the use of architecture to enable inspection for prisons, workhouses, factories, insane asylums, hospitals, and schools. Foucault here gives a relatively documentary account of what Bentham proposes for the ideal prison's construction. The prison should be a circular building with a central watchtower. Around this will be cells that are backlit with a window, allowing light to flow in and through the cell so as to make the prisoner visible to anyone looking from within the prison. In this way, a guard in the tower, okay, so you've got a central tower, and there are kind of guards in this central tower. They can kind of look out in any direction they like. So in this way, a guard in the tower can observe the cells, the inhabitants of which will never know if they are being watched or not, since the tower's watchroom is either cast in shadows or visually obstructed. So if you're a prisoner, you can never know whether you're being observed or not. You could be being observed at any moment, but you'll never know whether you're actually being observed or not. If traditional prisons meant to enclose prisoners and hide them without light, Bentham only seeks to enclose them, but this time in full view, where they can be controlled by surveillance. In this scheme, visibility is a trap. The panopticon thus both automates and de-individualizes the functioning of power, especially as it no longer matters who is in the central tower, or even if there is anyone at all. The prison becomes much cheaper and more efficient to run as it relies on the prisoner's sense of being watched rather than being threatened with physical force. See, that's the point. You see, the prisoner can never know whether they're being watched at any particular moment, but they could be being watched at any moment. So it's kind of auto surveillance that results from this. By isolating every individual in their own cell, the panopticon breaks up the possibility of prisoners forming collectives, and it turns every prisoner into the object of information, never a subject in communication. Yet the panopticon's major effect is to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. Because a prisoner can never know if he or she is being watched, the prisoner thus becomes the principle of their own subjection as they constantly police their behavior in the fear that they might be being observed at any time. See, this is the clever part of it, isn't it? If you never know when you're being whether you are actually being watched at a particular moment, you have to constantly police your behavior all the time, just in case you're being watched at a particular moment. Okay, so this is the idea of the panopticon. So in other words, he discusses this suggestion by Jeremy Bentham, which is it's a suggestion for the design of actual buildings. But what Foucault is interested in is the effect that this design is going to have on the people who are kind of caught up in this. And this is where the notion of discipline comes in. So let me summarize this. The panopticon is a prison with a tower in the middle and cells all around an outer circle such that a guard in the center could at any time be looking into any of the cells. Because of this, the prisoners begin to monitor their own behavior. You see, that's the key point. If you're under surveillance in this way, and you can never know when you're actually being observed, you begin to monitor your own behavior at all times. And that is the point that Foucault is making. This idea has been linked to the high degree of surveillance that we now have in much of the world, meaning that we could actually, most of the time, be being watched or recorded. So this is the idea of a surveillance society. Foucault used the panopticon to illuminate the ways in which people in contemporary societies become so aware of the various critical gazes upon them that they end up self-monitoring their own actions through fear that they might not be acceptable to others. This has developed into a culture where everybody polices themselves through fear of punishment, ridicule, and disapproval. People are encouraged to scrutinize and judge themselves at all times, to improve and work on themselves, and to present a positive and successful self to the world based on the messages they receive about what counts as normal. Okay, so this is the way, this is a new way for power to operate, Foucault says, and it's quite different to the traditional way that power operated in traditional societies. Okay, let me go back a little bit. If you go back to sheet 86, again, they're talking about the nature of disciplinary power here. actually, let's go back to 85 and then come on to 86. So the key idea here is the idea of normalizing judgment. Individuals are simultaneously watched and evaluated. We all have the sense of ourselves as being exposed at all times to a normalizing judgment. Okay, I'm on 85 on the right-hand side at the foot now. Normalizing differs from prior historical systems of punishments, which had a fixed code of rules that must be remembered and followed. The new system is now much more plastic and mobile, since the norm is determined in relation to an ever-changing hierarchy within the network of other people. Okay, I'm going over onto 86. We're judged not based on our own achievements or transgressions, but in relationship to what everyone else is doing. In the prior system of social control, one more or less could avoid punishment by not committing prescribed acts. In the disciplinary model, one must be ever alert to how one's behavior and personality exists in relationship to others. Whereas the older model punished illegal acts, the penalty of the norm measures the nature of individuals. That is, disciplinary power constructs and targets identities rather than acts. You're always asking yourself, you know, am I normal? It's that kind of question. Am I normal or am I abnormal? This institutes a sort of constant paranoia where individuals can never stop comparing their actions and nature to the perceived or assumed intangible norm. Yet because the group defining the norm is hard to see or comfortably know, since it is constantly fluid, we can never allow ourselves to rest in the secure knowledge that we have done the right thing. Since only the authority who can observe everyone is able to know what is the collective standard, we're in a state of anxiety, wondering if our actions are sufficiently normal or not. Are we eating too much or too little, for example? Are our sexual desires acceptable or perverted? And so on. This uncertainty makes us more dependent on authorities like doctors, teachers, and so on, to tell us if our actions, personalities, and bodies are normal or not. Additionally, we also begin to internalize the function of supervision. Even in the absence of a supervisor, we begin to interrogate ourselves to see if they're acceptably normal. Okay, I hope this is adding up to a picture that you can all recognize. One point that I would make is that Foucault was very strongly influenced by Heidegger, of course, Martin Heidegger, who we were talking about 2 weeks ago. And Heidegger has this notion in Being and Time of what he calls the they, or das Man, that because we exist as being in a world, what that means is that we exist for the most part as the average member of our particular culture and group and so on. That's the idea of das Man. Basically, we exist as the average member of our culture. Now, obviously, Foucault was very strongly influenced by that here. And not only Foucault, Lacan also. Lacan has the notion of the big other, which is like the totality of society. These ideas come from Heidegger. I would suggest they're both influenced by Heidegger. Okay, so I hope this is giving you a sense of what Foucault means by disciplinary power, and that this is a different kind of power. This is Foucault's point. The point he wants to underline is that this is a completely different kind of power to the kind of power that we are used to, the kind of power that was exercised in traditional societies, namely sovereign power, which is a kind of top-down power, the kind of power that tells you not to do specific things and punishes people who do those specific things. Again, they've put this in a diagram. If you go to page. Go to page 84. Yeah. I'm on page 84 on the right-hand side, the lower half of that column. Foucault illustrates his idea of how this modern form of power works. Two aspects are particularly important. Disciplinary power is a network of relations that move from top to bottom, but also, to a certain extent, from bottom to top and laterally. This is an important qualification that distinguishes Foucault's definition of modern power from those of other theoreticians who stress the repressive aspect of power from top to bottom. Secondly, disciplinary power is not possessed as a thing. It functions like a piece of machinery. Again, Foucault here departs from other concepts of power, especially in the Marxist tradition, who see power as the property of a particular group. And he replaces this with the notion of relational power that is everywhere and always alert. Importantly, this definition of power is able to explain how individuals whose overall power may be limited can simultaneously be complicit in their own subjection and that of others. Again, I mean, the key thing is the idea of self-surveillance and self-monitoring. And that's what he's going to use in history of sexuality. Foucault uses the spatial metaphor of the pyramid to suggest that modern power may have a head, but that individuals are distributed more widely in the field of power. Okay, so that's really what I want to say about discipline and punish as a kind of, just as a background to history of sexuality. In Discipline and Punish, he's developed this new idea of power. And the idea of this new kind of power, disciplinary power, is that rather than being power that prohibits, this is power that actually produces things, and that's the key notion. The idea of power as creating something new, and this kind of power, disciplinary power, does that. Okay, I'm going to give you another quotation. This is from David Halperin, from his book on Foucault. It's called Saint Foucault Towards a Gay Hagiography, by David Halperin. I'm sorry, I should have put this on the list. I don't think I put it on the list. I'll give you a brief quote from Halperin. He's talking specifically about this notion of power. The kind of power Foucault is interested in, far from enslaving its objects, constructs them as subjective agents and preserves them in their autonomy so as to invest them all the more completely. So he's thinking of power as constructing subjective agents. That's what disciplinary power does, kind of constructs us as agents, but it constructs us as kind of self-monitoring agents. So liberal power, it's got a political dimension to this. Foucault constantly wants to critique liberal ideas, and this is part of his critique of liberal ideas. Liberal power, which is this modern disciplinary power, does not simply prohibit, it does not directly terrorize, it normalizes, it responsibilizes and disciplines. The state no longer needs to frighten or coerce its subjects into proper behavior. It can safely leave them to make their own choices in the allegedly sacrosanct private sphere of personal freedom which they now inhabit, okay? Because within that sphere, they freely and spontaneously police both their own conduct and the conduct of others. You see, that is the point of disciplinary power. We're kind of self-monitoring agents, constantly looking at our own behavior and trying to decide whether we're kind of normal or abnormal. So modern power then can safely leave individuals to make their own choices in the allegedly sacrosanct private sphere of personal freedom, which they now inhabit, because within that sphere they freely and spontaneously police both their own conduct and the conduct of others. This dark vision of modernity, and it is a dark vision of modernity, I think you'll agree, this dark vision of modernity, of the liberal state, and of progressive Enlightenment era values such as freedom, truth, and rationality shocked traditional liberals. And that's what Foucault is really trying to do, of course. It's really, there's this wonderful phrase in French, which is épater la bourgeoisie, which is it to shock the bourgeoisie? Épater la bourgeoisie. That's what Foucault really wants to do. And one thinks of his father, who's this very solid bourgeois figure with a lot of control, a lot of power in it, that's kind of local area, and the doctor, and a very powerful doctor as well. And you know, one feels that his kind of lifelong project was to shock the bourgeoisie, people like his father, really. But he does that by producing this dark vision of modernity. According to Foucault, civil society, scientific research, intellectual activity, and personal life, you see, these are the values of the Enlightenment. These are not, in fact, free zones from which power has progressively retreated since the Enlightenment. They are colonized spaces into which it has steadily expanded, proliferated, and diffused itself. Foucault shows, in History of Sexuality 1 especially, that the separation of public and private, of power and knowledge, which is characteristic of modern liberal societies, has not limited, as it is supposed to have done, the operative field of power, but instead has functioned strategically to extend the reach of power and multiply techniques of social control. Modern liberalism has eliminated certain modes of domination, but only to produce many others, which do not present themselves as modes of domination and are all the more difficult to challenge or oppose because of that. Liberalism has championed an ethic and an ideal of personal freedom, while making the exercise of that freedom conditional upon personal submission to new and insidious forms of authority, namely the norm, submission to the norm, and to ever more deeply internalized mechanisms of constraint. So this, I think, is the essence of what Foucault is saying in Discipline and Punish. So bear this in mind then when he's talking about history of sexuality. He's going to tell, in History of Sexuality, he's telling a historical story, the same way that he does in History of Madness. He's telling a historical story, and this is a story he's telling is about the story of the emergence of sexuality as we experience and understand it now. Okay, and he's telling the story of how that emerged finally at the end of the 19th century. But you'll realize, with the background of what I've just said, that he sees sexuality as a product and an instrument of this modern form of power, disciplinary power, which he has described in Discipline and Punish. So the sexuality that emerges, it is an instrument of modern power, of disciplinary power. Okay, I hope that makes some kind of sense. Okay, let's how are we doing for time now? Okay, we're not doing too badly for time. I really need some kind of comments, questions, or observations, please, if there's anybody out there. Because I have no idea at the moment whether what I've said is making any sense, but I'm going to press on now to History of Sexuality anyway. So let me, yeah. Okay, History of Sexuality, 1976. It's a relatively short book compared with History of Madness anyway. It begins with part one. Part one is called We Are the Victorians, and that is the opening section. It runs from page 3 up to page 13, I think. So it's not a long section, but that's the opening of the book, which kind of sketches really what he's going to talk about in the book, and it puts you in the picture about his argument, the argument that he's going to make. We are the Victorians. So I thought it will be an idea if we look at that section, which sets the scene for the whole book. So that's the opening section called We Are the Victorians. Then you have the second section, the second chapter, if you like, which is called The Incitement to Discourse, and that is followed by The Perverse Implantation. Now, those two chapters give the basis of Foucault's story of how sexuality emerges. Okay, the incitement to discourse and the perverse implantation. They are the two chapters of part two of the book. Part two of the book is called The Repressive Hypothesis. And the repressive hypothesis is the kind of story which Foucault thinks we have traditionally told ourselves about sexuality. The repressive hypothesis is what we tell ourselves about sexuality, but he's going to question that. He's going to put forward a new story about the, so you could just say, putting it alongside History of Madness, as far as madness was concerned, the traditional story which we told ourselves was that in the 19th century, doctors discovered and scientists discovered that madness was in fact mental illness. It was rooted in a disorder of the brain or biochemistry, or what would later in the 20th century become identified as genetic abnormalities. And so that is the traditional story that we kind of we made a scientific discovery in the 19th century that madness was in fact mental illness. Foucault challenges that story in History of Madness and gives his own alternative historical story about how the notion of madness as mental illness emerged. And that's what we looked at yesterday. The same thing is going on in History of Sexuality. The traditional story we tell ourselves about sexuality is the repressive hypothesis. Foucault says that's his name for it. And the repressive hypothesis is the idea that since the beginning of the modern period, there has been a progressive repression of sexuality, which kind of starts in the 17th and 18th century, but really kicks in a big way in the Victorian period. So the Victorian period is when the repression of sexuality really hits home. And then within the traditional story, Freud comes along as someone who challenges the repression of sexuality, because he argues that repressed sexuality is at the origin of much neurotic illness. But although Freud challenges the repression of sexuality, this doesn't fundamentally change the situation, because psychoanalysis, after all, is something that is only kind of experienced by a vanishingly small number of people. So sexuality continues to be repressed, and the way that story has developed is that in the middle of the 20th century, Marxism and psychoanalysis have joined together in a kind of unholy alliance, which says that the reason that sexuality began to be repressed from the beginning of the modern period is that capitalism needed the kind of workers to put their energy mainly into their labor. So Marxism and Freudianism kind of join together to kind of reinforce each other. That gives a kind of extra justification to the repressive hypothesis. So by the 1960s, what we're telling ourselves is, yes, it's capitalism that requires us to repress sexuality. What we need to do is break free from those repressions, and you even get the story that if we overcome the repression of sexuality, that will actually change society. That will produce a revolution in society, which will take us beyond capitalism. So this is the idea of sexual liberation. The idea of sexual liberation is rooted in the notion that we have, since the beginning of the modern period, we have increasingly repressed sexuality, and that modern society is characterized by that repression of sexuality. Sexual liberation is rooted in that idea. Okay, this is the repressive hypothesis. It's the traditional story that we've told ourselves about sexuality, Foucault says. But what he's going to do is he's going to challenge that story, and he does that by giving his own alternative account of how our modern experience of sexuality emerged. Okay, so I hope that makes some sense just as a brief introduction to the book. Let's begin by looking at We Other Victorians. I've actually given you this whole section because it's only 10 pages. It begins on page 40 in your course booklet, which on the right-hand side. So let's look at that. Perhaps if I could just get my breath for a second before we begin on that, and then we'll start on We Are the Victorians. Okay, thank you for that brief pause. let's begin on history of sexuality. So I'm going to just read the opening paragraph or two. So this is how he begins. For a long time, the story goes, we supported a Victorian regime, and we continue to be dominated by it even today. Thus, the image of the imperial prude is emblazoned on our restrained, mute, and hypocritical sexuality. Okay, that's the opening paragraph. The imperial prude, I mean, he's referring to our beloved Queen Victoria, isn't he? I mean, the French, they're just so jealous of our royal family. I mean, you know. But the point is the Victoria, he says for a long time we supported a Victorian regime. In other words, this is a story we tell ourselves. We tell ourselves that we have repressed our sexuality and that we continue to do so. The image of the imperial prude is emblazoned on our restrained, mute, and hypocritical sexuality. In other words, we see ourselves as being kind of sexually repressed in modern Western society. So then in the paragraphs that follow, he begins to set out this story. So the story he's setting out here, this is not Foucault's own view. The story he's setting out is the repressive hypothesis, which is the view he's going to challenge in the book. So he says, at the beginning of the 17th century, a certain frankness was still common. It would seem sexual practices had little need of secrecy. Words were said without undue reticence. Things were done without too much concealment. One had a tolerant familiarity with the illicit. Then going down to the beginning of the next paragraph, but twilight soon fell upon this bright day, followed by the monotonous nights of the Victorian bourgeoisie. So in other words, there was a period going back to the beginning of the 17th century where sexuality people just let it all hang out, as it were. Nobody had any hang-ups. But then twilight soon fell on this bright day, followed by the monotonous nights of the Victorian bourgeoisie. Sexuality was carefully confined. It moved into the home. So this is the story, isn't it? A single locus of sexuality was acknowledged in social space as well as at the heart of every household, but it was a utilitarian and fertile one, the parents' bedroom. So in the Victorian period, then sexuality gets confined. The only legitimate sexuality is the sexuality that takes place in the parents' bedroom. In other words, sexuality which is for the purpose of reproduction. Okay, if you go onto sheet 42, that's where it continues. Okay. And he goes on. Nothing that was not ordered in terms of generation or transfigured by it could expect sanction or protection. Nor did it merit a hearing. It will be driven out, denied, and reduced to silence. Not only did it not exist, it had no right to exist and would be made to disappear upon its least manifestation, whether in acts or words. Everyone knew, for example, that children had no sex, which was why they were forbidden to talk about it, why one closed one's eyes and stopped one's ears whenever they came to show evidence to the contrary, and why a general and studied silence was imposed. These are the characteristic features attributed to repression, which serve to distinguish it from the prohibitions maintained by penal law. Repression operated as a sentence to disappear, but also as an injunction to silence, an affirmation of non-existence, and by implication, an admission that there was nothing to say about such things, nothing to see, and nothing to know. if it was truly necessary to make room for illegitimate sexualities, it was reasoned, let them take their infernal mischief elsewhere, to a place where they could be reintegrated, if not in the circuits of production, at least in those of profit. The brothel and the mental hospital would be those places of tolerance. The prostitute, the client, and the pimp, together with the psychiatrist and the hysteric, those other Victorians, as Stephen Marcus would say, seem to have surreptitiously transferred the pleasures that are unspoken into the order of things that are counted. Okay, so he's referring to the book by Stephen Marcus. I mean, Stephen Marcus talks about the Victorian era, the era of repression, but underlines the fact that there are these other Victorians operating within the society, but in different places within society. There's a kind of sexual underground, in other words, in Victorian society, where people operate very differently, and those are the other Victorians. Okay. So this is the repressive hypothesis, and this is what Foucault is going to challenge. So let me go on to the next page. If you go to the right-hand side of 42, he goes on, but have we not liberated ourselves from those 2 long centuries in which the history of sexuality must be seen, first of all, as the chronicle of an increasing repression? So that's the thing. Have we not liberated ourselves from this repression? I mean, after all, you know, we've had Freud and all the rest of it, so surely we should have been able to liberate ourselves by now. But we haven't, in fact, liberated ourselves. According to the repressive hypothesis, we still are repressed. Some progress was made by Freud, but with such circumspection, such medical prudence, a scientific guarantee of innocuousness, and so many precautions in order to contain everything, with no fear of overflow, in that safest and most discreet of spaces between the couch and discourse. Yet another round of whispering on a bed. Could things have been otherwise? So, okay, Freud is not enough, you know, for us to be able to liberate ourselves from sexual repression. Then going to the foot of that page, let me move on with his argument. He brings another aspect in here, at the foot of the right-hand side of 42. No doubt this discourse on modern sexual repression holds up well, owing to how easy it is to uphold. So what he's suggesting now, that this notion of sexual repression it's very easy to uphold. In fact, it's very easy to argue for this point of view. Then he says, by placing the advent of the age of repression in the 17th century after hundreds of years of open spaces and free expression, one adjusts it to coincide with the development of capitalism. So this is one reason why it's so easy to uphold the notion of repression, because Freudianism and Marxism seem to come together, you know, which are both very powerful influences on our understanding of society. They seem to come together to support the repressive hypothesis. That is one factor. Okay, let's go on. We go to page 37. I'm sorry there's all this jumping around. I seem to be doing something very creative with the photocopying. I'm not sure why. But you go to page 37, that's the next step. Okay, I'm going to skip over what he says about Freud and Marx, but the fact that Freud and Marx combined in this way obviously gives kind of powerful support to the repressive hypothesis. But in the middle of 37, he says, there may be another reason that makes it so gratifying for us to define the relation between sex and power in terms of repression, something one might call the speaker's benefit. If sex is repressed, that is, condemned to prohibition, non-existence, and silence, then the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. A person who holds forth in such language places himself to a certain extent outside the reach of power. He upsets established law. He somehow anticipates the coming freedom. So this is what Foucault means by the speaker's benefit. In other words, it's very self-gratifying to go around talking about sexual repression and what a sexually repressed society we are, because by doing that, you seem to be placing yourself outside the reach of power. You seem to be positioning yourself as a representative of some kind of liberation, you see, just by talking about this. That's what Foucault means by the speaker's benefit. If we talk about how sexually repressed we are, we're conscious of defying established power. Our tone of voice shows that we know we're being subversive, and we ardently conjure away the present and appeal to the future, whose day will be hastened by the contribution we believe we are making. Something that smacks of revolt, of promised freedom, of the coming age of a different law, slips easily into this discourse of sexual oppression. Okay, going a little bit further down on the right of 37, what sustains our eagerness to speak of sex in terms of repression is doubtless this opportunity to speak out against the powers that be, to utter truths and promise bliss, to link together enlightenment, liberation, and manifold pleasures, to pronounce a discourse that combines the fervor of knowledge, the determination to change the laws, and the longing for the garden of earthly delights. Okay, so this is why it's so it's such an attractive proposition to advocate this notion of sexual repression. Because by doing so, we seem to be positioning ourselves as the kind of prophets of a kind of coming age of sexual liberation. And he takes this further, the foot of the right-hand side of 37, and then going on to 38, he says there's even a kind of religious aspect to this argument. The repressive hypothesis, it becomes a great sexual sermon, he says, people preaching sexual liberation, a sermon that has swept through our societies over the last decades. It has chastised the old order, denounced hypocrisy, and praised the rights of the immediate and the real. It has made people dream of a new city. The Franciscans are called to mind. So I think really he's kind of he's talking about the idea of sexual liberation as almost a kind of religious idea. And I think really you've got to remember that when he wrote the book, it was written in 1975, 1976. So I mean, at that period, the idea of sexual liberation, which was quite powerful in the 1960s, I mean, that idea was still very much around, I think. And also, of course, the idea of sexual liberation was very different then because in the 1960s, we were still in this period of innocence, comparatively, where sexuality is concerned, because this is before the age of AIDS, which comes later, which really changes everything. So in the 1960s, you've got this very innocent idea of sexual liberation as being the kind of solution to all our problems. Okay. So this brings us to the core of the repressive hypothesis. I'm on page 38 now, where he says, the affirmation of a sexuality that has never been more rigorously subjugated than during the age of the hypocritical, bustling, and responsible bourgeoisie is coupled with the grandiloquence of a discourse purporting to reveal the truth about sex. modify its economy within reality, subvert the law that governs it, and change its future. So this really is the heart of the repressive hypothesis, and this explains the kind of hold that the repressive hypothesis has over us, Foucault thinks. Okay. So halfway down the left-hand side of 38, he begins his kind of summing up. Up to this point, he's been kind of rehearsing the repressive hypothesis with only kind of implied criticisms of it. But halfway down 38, he says, this is the point at which I would like to situate the series of historical analyses which follow. In other words, in his historical analyses, he's going to tell a very different story, and he's going to show that the repressive hypothesis is untenable if you look at the actual historical emergence of our contemporary experience of sexuality. Okay, so this is the point at which I would like to situate the series of historical analyses which follow. And then he says briefly, so this is the aim in his book, History of Sexuality. Briefly, my aim is to examine the case of a society which has been loudly castigating itself for its hypocrisy for more than a century, a society which speaks verbosely of its own silence, takes great pains to relate in detail the things it does not say, denounces the powers it exercises, and promises to liberate itself from the very laws that have made it function. So this is his aim in the book. In other words, he's going to show that this whole notion of sexual repression is self-contradictory in practice. Because you're talking about a society which has been loudly castigating itself for its hypocrisy for more than a century, which speaks verbosely of its own silence. We talk about sexual repression, but we talk on and on and on about sexual repression, making sex the center of our kind of interest. I would like to explore not only these discourses, but also the will that sustains them and the strategic intention that supports them. The question I would like to pose is not why are we repressed, but rather why do we say with so much passion and so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present, and against ourselves that we are repressed? Okay, that's the question he wants to ask. Why do we say with so much passion and so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present, and against ourselves that we are repressed? Why do we say this? Why do we keep repeating the repressive hypothesis over and over? By what spiral did we come to affirm that sex is negated? What led us to show ostentatiously that sex is something we hide, to say it is something we silence, and so on? What has led us into this strange, rather contradictory position? What paths have brought us to the point where we are at fault with respect to our own sex? And how have we come to be a civilization so peculiar as to tell itself that through an abuse of power which has not ended, it has long sinned against sex? Okay, so how have we got into this strange position of constantly telling ourselves that we repress our sexuality? Okay, how are we doing for time? We're coming up towards the break. Just let me quickly end this, and then after the break I can go on to the next part of the book. He goes on, it will be said that if so many people today affirm this repression, the reason is that it is historically evident. In other words, if people keep talking about the repression of sexuality, it must actually be a fact. And if they speak of it so abundantly as they have for such a long time now, this is because repression is so firmly anchored, having solid roots and reasons, and weighs so heavily on sex, that more than one denunciation will be required in order to free ourselves from it. The job will be a long one. We must not be surprised then if the effects of liberation vis-a-vis this repressive power are so slow to manifest themselves. Okay, and then going on to sheet 39, I'm going to end this quickly now and then we can have a break. This is the end of this section, this first section of the book. So at the end of this, he kind of sums up where his argument is going. So I'm on page 39, just below the top. He says, one can raise three serious doubts concerning what I shall term the repressive hypothesis. Okay, so the first doubt is sexual repression truly an established historical fact? Is what first comes into view really the accentuation or even the establishment of a regime of sexual repression beginning in the 17th century? Is that a historical fact? That's his first doubt that he wants to raise. Then, do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, really belong primarily to the category of repression? So this is the second point, and this goes back to what we were saying about discipline and punish earlier. Do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, do the mechanisms of power really belong primarily to the category of repression? So that's a question about power. Does power in our societies really work that way? Is power in our societies primarily about repression? That's the second doubt he wants to raise. And you'll see from what we said about discipline and punishment, he's going to say that power in modern society does not operate mainly through repression. Power is productive rather than prohibitive. And that kind of power creates things rather than kind of stopping them. So the first question is the historical question. Was there actually repression, increase of repression from 17th century onward? The second question is a question about power. Is repression the main mechanism through which power operates in our society? And then thirdly, his third doubt, did the critical discourse that addresses itself to repression come to act as a roadblock to a power mechanism that had operated unchallenged up to that point? Or is it not in fact part of the same historical network as the thing it denounces by calling it repression? Okay, so that's his third doubt. So his third doubt is about the repressive hypothesis itself. Is the repressive hypothesis itself really part of the operation of this different form of power that has come into play in modern societies? That's what he's saying with the third doubt. So those are the three doubts that he's going to raise about the repressive hypothesis. That brings us up more or less to the end of the first section of the book. Okay, how are we doing for time now? Okay, it's just after 3 o'clock. Let's stop now for a break of 20 minutes. We'll start again, say 20 past or 25 past, and we'll go on to Foucault's positive arguments about what actually happened. How did sexuality actually emerge? We'll go on to that after the break. Okay, welcome back from the break. I hope you all had nice coffee. What I was doing before the break, I was just looking at the opening section of History of Sexuality 1. And in that opening section, Foucault is setting out what he calls the repressive hypothesis, which is the story we have traditionally told ourselves about sexuality in the West. The story that sexuality is repressed in modern Western society, that the process of sexual repression started in the 17th century, and then picked up pace in the 18th, but repression became, very, very kind of heavy in the 19th century, the Victorian period. The Victorian period is the period we look to as exemplifying the most repressive aspects of modern Western society. But then in some ways we haven't really moved beyond that, because we believe that we're still basically sexually repressed. I mean, Freud obviously comes along at the end of the 19th century, and he teaches us that the repression of sexuality produces neurotic disorders, and he also stands for a more kind of free sexual life. But that doesn't dissolve the kind of the sexual repression that we as modern Western people are kind of subject to. This is the repressive hypothesis. So Foucault sets that idea out in the first section of the book. And then at the end of the first section, he kind of says what he's going to do in the book, which is that he's going to question that understanding of who we are, essentially. And he does this, he begins to do this quite effectively at the end of the section, when he says, look, he wants to look at the rather peculiar case of a society which is constantly talking about itself as sexually repressed. You see, that means we're constantly drawing attention to sexuality, but what we're saying about sexuality is that we're silencing it. And this is rather contradictory. So he's going to kind of question this notion of modern Western society as being based on sexual repression. Okay, so that's the first section of the book. What I want to do is move on from that now, because in chapters 2 and 3, the next two chapters, he sets out his account of what actually happened historically. And that's what I want to look at now. In fact, there are 3 chapters. The chapter called The Incitement to Discourse. Then there is a chapter called The Perverse Implantation. And then the chapter following that is called Scientia Sexualis, the Science of Sex. And it's in those 3 chapters that he sets out his historical account. So I want to look at what he says in those three chapters now. And when we've done that, I want to go on and kind of think about, what he said, and particularly the relation to Freud, what he's saying about Freud. Freud plays a more central role in History of Sexuality than he does in History of Madness, because when Foucault's talking about the sciences of sexuality, he thinks of psychoanalysis being the kind of premier science of sexuality. So Freud really is in the crosshairs much more in History of Sexuality than he is in History of Madness. But we need to look exactly at what Foucault says about that. Okay, so I'm going to try and do that now. I'm going to look at those chapters: The Incitement to Discourse, then the perverse implantation, then scientia sexualis. Those 3 chapters. That is basically the first half of the book. Then the second half of the book is more kind of heavily theoretical still. I'm going to make my excuses when we come to. I mean, you can only do so much in a course of this length, I think. And if I can manage to set out what he actually says about sexuality in the first half of the book, I think I will have done quite well. So there was an anonymous comment that's being sent in that says, thank you for the thought-provoking readings. I really appreciate that comment. Thank you very much for that. It's very nice of you. Okay, so going on then, if you've got your copy of History of Sexuality, Volume 1, I'm now in what is called Part 2, and very confusingly, it's called the repressive hypothesis. Part 2, the repressive hypothesis. But Part 2 is not about the repressive hypothesis. Part 2 is about Foucault's own view of what actually happened. It's in Part 1, We Are the Victorians, that we just looked at, where he actually talks about the repressive hypothesis. So the whole thing is very confusingly let me have a look, see if it's the same in the French edition before I plunge into this. Yeah, it is. It's the same in the French edition. Part 2 is called the repressive hypothesis. Part 3 is called the scientia sexualis. So I'm on, going back to the English edition, I'm on page 17 on this chapter called The Incitement to Discourse. Goes from page 17 up to page 35. That's the incitement to discourse. So you'll realize, of course, from that title, the incitement to discourse, well, that is the opposite of what the repressive hypothesis is saying, isn't it? Because the repressive hypothesis is saying that we are kind of prevented from speaking about sexuality. We're not allowed to speak about sexuality. That's what the repressive hypothesis is saying. Foucault is saying, no, the actual historical facts about modern Western society is that there is an incitement to discourse about sexuality. Okay, so this is the theme of this chapter. So let's look at what he's saying in this chapter. So the incitement to discourse. Now he starts off by admitting that there is evidence of some restriction of speech. He says, I'll just read a few lines from the beginning. The 17th century then was the beginning of an age of repression, emblematic of what we call the bourgeois societies, an age which perhaps we still have not completely left behind. Calling sex by its name thereafter became more difficult and more costly, and so on and so on. Going down to the next paragraph, which is where he begins to give his own take on this. He says, when one looks back over these last 3 centuries, going back to the 17th century, with their continual transformations, things appear in a very different light. Around and apropos of sex, one sees a veritable discursive explosion. Okay, this is the theme of the chapter. Around and apropos of sex, one sees a veritable discursive explosion. And then he goes on, we must be clear on this point, however. It's quite possible that there was an expurgation, and a very rigorous one, of the authorized vocabulary. It may indeed be true that a whole rhetoric of illusion and metaphor was codified. Without question, new rules of propriety screened out some words. There was a policing of statements, a control over enunciations as well. where and when it was not possible to talk about such things became much more strictly defined, in which circumstances, among which speakers, and within which social relationships. Areas were thus established, if not of utter silence, at least of tact and discretion between parents and children, for instance, or teachers and pupils, or masters and domestic servants. This almost certainly constituted a whole restrictive economy, one that was incorporated into that politics of language and speech, spontaneous on the one hand, concerted on the other, which accompanied the social redistributions of the classical period. But then he goes on, at the level of discourses and their domains, however, practically the opposite phenomenon occurred. There was a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex. Specific discourses different from one another, both by their form and their object, a discursive ferment that gathered momentum from the 18th century onwards. Okay, so this is the first point there. There's a veritable discursive explosion, an explosion of discourses, explosion of discourses around sex. Now, in this chapter, he's going to look at the discursive explosion then that occurred over the last 3 centuries. But he takes it back to looking for kind of origin of this. He takes it back to the new rules that were introduced surrounding Catholic confession by the Council of Trent in the 16th century. So he sees this as being an important point of origin. So he begins to talk about this on page 18. Consider the evolution of the Catholic pastoral and the sacrament of penance after the Council of Trent. And then he looks at the changes which the Council of Trent brought in. One of them was that confession became far more frequent, and that the emphasis began to be placed on the penitent having to give kind of every detail of their kind of sexual thoughts and temptations, any temptations to carnality. This all had to be kind of spoken about. I mean, in the earlier periods, you would speak about actual sexual acts. For example, you would confess about particular sexual acts. After the Council of Trent, Foucault says, the emphasis went off sexual acts themselves. There was much more emphasis placed on intentions and thoughts. And confession was made much more frequent, so you are constantly having to confess your every kind of sexual thought. Okay, and Foucault sees this as he sees this as an important shift in Western culture. Let me see if I can find a quotation on this. You've got I'm on page 20 now, and history of sexuality. In the middle of page 20, he says, it was here perhaps that the injunction so peculiar to the West was laid down for the first time in the form of a general constraint. I'm not talking about the obligation to admit to violations of the laws of sex as required by traditional penance, but of the nearly infinite task of telling oneself and another as often as possible everything that might concern the interplay of innumerable pleasures, sensations, and thoughts, which, through the body and soul, had some affinity with sex. This scheme for transforming sex into discourse had been devised long before in an ascetic and monastic setting. So this is Foucault's idea. You see, it's the transformation, it's the idea of transforming sex into discourse. That's what he sees as being characteristic of the modern West. Okay, this desire to transform sex into discourse, and that gets a major impetus with the Council of Trent and the new rules about confession that are brought in with the Council of Trent. But what Foucault says is that this is on page 20. The scheme for transforming sex into discourse had been devised long before in an aesthetic and monastic setting. The 17th century made it into a rule for everyone. So, you know, it gets broadened out, he thinks, in the 17th century. So the scheme for transforming sex into discourse, the 17th century made it into a rule for everyone. Okay. And he says, going on to page 21, top of page 21, he says, an imperative was established. Not only will you confess to acts contravening the law, but you will seek to transform your desire, your every desire, into discourse. As far as possible, nothing was meant to elude this dictum, even if the words it employed had to be carefully neutralized. The Christian pastoral prescribed as a fundamental duty the task of passing everything having to do with sex through the endless mill of speech. Okay. So he sees then confession as being a kind of motor of this kind of change, but it spreads from the religious context. It spreads throughout society. This is what Foucault is saying. And then in the middle of 21, he says one could plot a line going straight from the 17th century pastoral to what became its projection in literature, scandalous literature at that. Tell everything, the directors would say time and time again. This is the directors of the confession, I think. Tell everything, not only consummated acts, but sensual touchings, all impure gazes, all obscene remarks, all consenting thoughts. Then Sard takes up the injunction in words that seem to have been retranscribed from the treatises of spiritual direction. Your narrations must be decorated with the most numerous and searching details, the precise way and extent to which we may judge how the passion you describe relates to human manners and man's character is determined by your willingness to disguise no circumstance. And what is more, the least circumstance is apt to have an immense influence upon the procuring of that kind of sensory irritation we expect from your stories. So he leaps from Catholic confession straight to the Marquis de Sade. But the principle is the same. That's what Foucault is saying. The principle is to say everything, to verbalize every possible desire, sexual desire. That is the same principle. It's there in confession, the new rules for confession, and it's there in the scandalous literature of the 18th century, like Sade. And then he also mentions an English text from the end of the 19th century. He says again at the end of the 19th century, the anonymous author of My Secret Life submitted to the same prescription. Outwardly, at least, this man was doubtless a kind of traditional libertine, but he conceived the idea of complementing his life, which he had almost totally dedicated to sexual activity, with a scrupulous account of every one of its episodes. So, in other words, My Secret Life, he describes everything that he does, all his sexual activity. He sometimes excuses himself by stressing his concern to educate young people. This man, who had 11 volumes published in a printing of only a few copies, which were devoted to the least adventures, pleasures, and sensations of his sex. Okay, so this again, it's the what Foucault calls the incitement to discourse, the need to transform sex into discourse. At the foot of page 22, Foucault goes on, this nameless Englishman who wrote My Secret Life will serve better than his queen as the central figure for a sexuality whose main features were already taking shape with the Christian pastoral. So the main features of his sexuality are the transformation of sex into discourse. Okay. Now, I mean, we could object, I suppose, that Foucault is being a bit Francocentric as usual, because he talks about the Catholic confession, but of course, what about the Protestant Reformation, which was kind of going on at this time? But the point is that the Protestant Reformation, you have the same principle essentially, that part of the objection of the Protestant reformers to Catholicism was that in Catholicism there had been in the past too much emphasis simply on acts, where the important thing was intention, the Protestants said. And so with the Protestants, you get this emphasis on exploring one's own kind of intentions. And with Protestantism, you begin to get the writing of autobiographies, for example, where people explore their experiences in a much deeper way. So Catholicism and Protestantism are not actually opposed on this fundamental principle. I mean, I would say that it represents a feature of a fairly profound change which is coming in early modernity. But let's come back to that later. Let me carry on with Foucault's argument for now. So we're talking about the incitement to discourse. So the commandment to transform desire into discourse is also the imperative followed by de Sade and the other pornographers. With pornography, the words may be supposed not merely to accompany life in the form of reportage, but as something that is in itself erotically enjoyable, regardless of its relation to fact. So again, this is another aspect of Foucault's argument, that with de Sade, for example, I mean, the words themselves, the writing of the words, no doubt, but also the reading of the words are supposed to be erotically enjoyable, regardless of any relation to actual facts. The writing itself is an erotic exercise. Foucault makes a comparison with the Christian confession in that one is supposed to enjoy the transformation of sex into discourse there too. He says, you've got the element of pleasure also in the confession, the fact of confessing these intimate secrets. So what is common then from the Council of Trent onwards is the increase in discourse, the transformation of sex into discourse, and the correlation of this increase in discourse to some modification of desire itself and to the pursuit of pleasure. So in other words, confession itself becomes a mode of sexual pleasure. So our desire for and enjoyment of sex is actually displaced by a desire for and enjoyment of the act of confessing, Foucault points out. Okay, moving on in this chapter, he looks at other kinds of discourse. I mean, apart from the Christian confession and pornography, he also considers the new kinds of administrative discourse that began in the 18th century when governments became aware of the problem of population and the need to have some kind of knowledge of the size of the population within their borders and the levels of health within the population and so on, and whether the population was growing or decreasing. So in that administrative context, new discourses came along, which were concerned with sex, new administrative discourses, and this also links up to medicine, of course, and psychology and jurisprudence. So you get kind of official discourses on sex in the 18th century as well. As an example of this, Foucault talks about he talks about this example of the itinerant farm labourer in rural France. This is a very famous example. It's on page 31 in History of Sexuality. One day in 1867, a farmhand from the village of Lapcourt, who was somewhat simple-minded, employed here, then there, depending on the season, living hand to mouth from a little charity or in exchange for the worst sort of labour, sleeping in barns and stables. This unfortunate chap was turned into the authorities. At the border of a field, he had obtained a few caresses from a little girl, just as he had done before, and seen done by the village urchins round about him. For at the edge of the wood or in a ditch by the road leading to Saint Nicolas, they would play the familiar game called curdled milk. So he was pointed out by the girl's parents to the mayor of the village, reported by the mayor to the gendarme, led by the gendarme to the judge, who indicted him and turned him over first to a doctor, then to two other experts, who not only wrote their report, but had it published. What is the significant thing about this story? Foucault asks. He says the pettiness of it all, the fact that this everyday occurrence in the life of village sexuality, these inconsequential bucolic pleasures, could become from a certain time the object not only of collective intolerance, but of judicial action, a medical intervention, a careful clinical examination, and an entire theoretical elaboration. The thing to note is that they went so far as to measure the brain pan, study the facial bone structure, and inspect for possible signs of degenerescence, the anatomy of this personage, who up to that moment had been an integral part of village life. That they made him talk, they questioned him concerning his thoughts, inclinations, habits, sensations. Then, acquitting him of any crime, they decided finally to make him into a pure object of medicine and knowledge, an object to be shut away till the end of his life in the hospital at Maréville, but also one to be made known to the world of learning through a detailed analysis. We can be fairly certain that during the same period, the Lapcourt schoolmaster was instructing the little villagers to mind their language and not talk about all these things aloud. But this was undoubtedly one of the conditions enabling the institutions of knowledge and power to overlay this everyday bit of theatre with their solemn discourse. So it was that our society, and it was doubtless the first in history to take such measures, assembled around these timeless gestures, these barely furtive pleasures between simple-minded adults and alert children, a whole machinery for speechifying, analysing, and investing. So in other words, what Foucault is saying is significant. This is 1867. He's saying by this point, you've got this whole apparatus of official discourses concerned with sexuality and different aspects of it, and they are all kind of brought into play to examine this unfortunate chap. And the result is a kind of lengthy series of reports are actually published based on what the doctors conclude through their examinations. Okay, I'll just read the next paragraph and then I'll move on. Between the licentious Englishman, in other words, the author of My Secret Diary, who earnestly recorded for his own purpose the singular episodes of his secret life, and his contemporary, this village half-wit, who would give a few pennies to the little girls for favours the older ones refused him, there was without doubt a profound connection. In any case, from one extreme to the other, sex became something to say, and to say exhaustively in accordance with deployments that were varied, but all in their own way compelling, whether in the form of a subtle confession in confidence or an authoritarian interrogation, Sex, be it refined or rustic, had to be put into words. A great polymorphous injunction banned the Englishman and the poor Lorenese peasant alike. Okay. So it's the proliferation of discourses which is significant, Foucault thinks. And this is quite a new phenomenon in the 19th century. So I'm just going to sum up the conclusion of this chapter now, if I can. What Foucault is saying is that what our Western modernity has invented is not the secrecy of sex, which was always there, insofar as there were always some prohibitions on speaking about sex, but the idea that secrecy must be ended through an infinite elaboration in discourse that uncovers true nature, the supposed true nature of sex. This elaboration can never end the secrecy, however, since there's no real kernel there to be discovered. We imagine that the secrecy surrounding sex has guarded some treasure that can be reached through speaking and dispelling the secrecy, but this treasure does not exist. Okay, let me give it to you in Foucault's words, if I can. Okay, I'll just read part of the paragraph on page 34. Rather than the uniform concern to hide sex, rather than a general prudishness of language, what distinguishes these last 3 centuries is the variety, the wide dispersion of devices that were invented for speaking about it, for having it be spoken about, for inducing it to speak of itself, for listening, recording, transcribing, and redistributing what is said about it. Around sex, a whole network of varying specific and coercive transpositions into discourse, rather than a massive censorship. Beginning with the verbal proprieties imposed by the age of reason, what was involved was a regulated and polymorphous incitement to discourse. Okay, so that's the conclusion to this chapter. So this is the actual history. There's a the last 3 centuries are characterized by a regulated and polymorphous incitement to discourse, all kinds of discourses about sexuality, which are endlessly proliferating. Okay, that's chapter 2, the incitement to discourse. I want to go on to the next chapter now, which is called the perverse implantation. Now, if you put these 2 chapters together, the incitement to discourse and the perverse implantation, you've got the core of what Foucault is saying about sexuality. And then I'll just round it off by looking at the chapter that follows, Scientia Sexualis, because that ties it into psychoanalysis. So the perverse implantation. This title again gives you really good indication of what Foucault wants to say here, the perverse implantation. He's going to say that what this incitement to discourse affects, what it does is it produces an implantation of perversions. Remembering, of course, that discourse is related to power. It's actually doing something. But this comes into the next chapter, the perverse implantation. Okay. So In the previous chapter, we've said that there's a massive proliferation of discourses concerning sexuality, but in this chapter, he's going to add to that it's not only a massive proliferation of discourses of sexuality, it is also a massive proliferation of sexuality itself. That's what he's going to say. And he kind of introduces this by talking about the traditional codes. At the end of the 18th century, before the end of the 18th century, there were three great codes, he said. Codes meaning laws, systems of laws. There's canon law, there's Christian pastoral, and there's civil law, three great systems of law. So where am I? This is on page 37, if you've got the text handy. Up to the end of the 18th century, three major explicit codes, apart from the customary regularities and constraints of opinion, govern sexual practices. So these three codes govern sexual practices. Canonical law, that's law within the church, I think, isn't it? Christian pastoral is what applies to the flock, as it were, I think, and civil law, which is the ordinary law of the land. They determined each in its own way the division between licit and illicit. They were all centered on matrimonial relations. So as far as sex was concerned, the three different systems of law were all centered on matrimonial relations. The marital obligation, the ability to fill it, and the manner in which one complied with it, the requirements and violences that accompanied it, and so on, and so on. It was this domain that was especially saturated with prescriptions. The sex of husband and wife was beset by rules and recommendations. The marriage relation was the most intense focus of constraints. It was spoken of more than anything else, more than any other relation. It was required to give a detailed accounting of itself. It was under constant surveillance. If it was found to be lacking, it had to come forward and plead its case before a witness. The rest remained a good deal more confused. In other words, sexual relations outside marriage was an area of much less kind of interest, and it was left more or less kind of vague what you were talking about. If you were talking about sex outside marriage, you were talking about something unnatural, but you didn't really, there wasn't really a great deal of thought about what that involved. The rest remained a good deal more confused. One only has to think of the uncertain status of sodomy or the indifference regarding the sexuality of children. So marriage was the focus, and there are all kinds of regulations about that. But sex outside marriage, well, it would be condemned. You weren't supposed to do it, but there weren't kind of, vast regulations, series of regulations about it. Okay, that's before the end of the 18th century, but that changed, and this is Foucault's theme. The discursive explosion changed this, Foucault says, by shifting the focus. With this discursive explosion, the explosion of discourses about sex, the focus shifted from the married couple, which now tended to be left more or less alone. The focus shifted onto the unnatural acts of sex. Okay, let me find this. Yeah, I'm on page 38 in the History of Sexuality. The discursive explosion of the 18th and 19th centuries caused this system, centered on legitimate alliance, to undergo two modifications. First, a centrifugal movement with respect to heterosexual monogamy. Of course, the array of practices and pleasures continued to be referred to it as their internal standard, but it was spoken of less and less, or in any case with a growing moderation. Efforts to find out its secrets were abandoned. Nothing further was demanded of it than to define itself from day to day. The legitimate couple with its regular sexuality had a right to more discretion. It tended to function as a norm, one that was stricter perhaps, but quieter. On the other hand, what came under scrutiny was the sexuality of children, madmen and women, and criminals, the sensuality of those who did not like the opposite sex, reveries, obsessions, petty manias, or great transports of rage. It was the time for all these figures, scarcely noticed in the past, to step forward and speak, to make the difficult confession of what they were. No doubt they were condemned all the same, but they were listened to. And if regular sexuality happened to be questioned once again, it was through a reflux movement originating in these peripheral sexualities. So with the explosion of discourses concerning sex, there was this shift away from the regulation of matrimonial sex. The shift was towards the peripheral sexualities. That's what became of interest now. The peripheral sexualities. Okay, what he does is he talks about Don Juan here. Don Juan, he's the man who seduces an enormous number of women, isn't he? So you might say, well, what's the problem there? But because what he's doing is perfectly natural, it's heterosexual sex, but the fact that he does it with so many women, he's got this kind of compulsive need to go from woman to woman to woman. It ends up being unnatural because of the kind of compulsive repetition involved. Don Juan or Don Giovanni, whatever we want to call him, he becomes representative of a new category that's emerging, the category of the unnatural person. He becomes a representative of what comes to be called perversion, because perversion is this category of the unnatural sexuality that they're all kind of interested in now. Okay, so on where am I now? I'm on page 39 in History of Sexuality. So Don Giovanni, underneath the great violator of the rules of marriage, stealer of wives, seducer of virgins, the shame of families, and an insult to husbands and fathers, another personage can be glimpsed. The individual, driven in spite of himself by the somber madness of sex. Underneath the libertine, the pervert. He deliberately breaks the law, but at the same time, something like a nature gone awry transports him far from all nature. His death is the moment when the supernatural return of the crime and its retribution thwarts the flight into counter nature. There were two great systems conceived by the West for governing sex: the law of marriage and the order of desires. Now, the life of Don Juan overturned them both. Okay, so this shift away from the regulation of the matrimonial relation, the shift to putting the emphasis on natural desires, on the peripheral sexuality. This resulted in something new. There emerged a world of perversion, Foucault says, that partook of that of legal or moral infraction, yet was not simply a variety of the latter. An entire sub-race was born, he says, different, despite certain kinship ties, from the libertines of the past. From the end of the 18th century to our own, they circulated through the pores of society. They were always hounded, but not always by laws, were often locked up, but not always in prisons. were sick perhaps, but scandalous, dangerous victims, prey to a strange evil that also bore the name of vice and sometimes crime. They were children wise beyond their years, precocious little girls, ambiguous schoolboys, dubious servants and educators, cruel or maniacal husbands, solitary collectors, ramblers with bizarre impulses. They haunted the houses of correction, the penal colonies, the tribunals, and the asylums. They carried their infamy to the doctors and their sickness to the judges. This was the numberless family of perverts who were on friendly terms with delinquents and akin to madmen. In the course of the century, they successively bore the stamp of moral folly, genital neurosis, aberration of the genetic instinct, degenerescence, or physical imbalance. So this is really the key theme of this chapter. There emerged a world of perversion. An entire subrace was born. Well, what does the appearance of all these peripheral sexualities signify? Is the fact that they could appear in broad daylight a sign that the code had become more lax, or does the fact that they were given so much attention testify to a stricter regime and to its concern to bring them under close supervision? Okay, I'm going to go on to page 41, because this is where he takes up his main theme. He brings in the idea of power here, because the idea of power is necessary to explain the emergence of the world of perversion, he's saying. So I'm in the middle of page 41. Perhaps the point to consider is not the level of indulgence or the quantity of repression, but the form of power that was exercised. When this whole thicket of disparate sexualities was labelled, as if to disentangle them from one another, was the object to exclude them from reality? It appears, in fact, that the function of the power exercised in this instance was not that of interdiction, that it involved four operations quite different from simple prohibition. So he's talking about the operation of power, because the explosion of discourse, it's not simply a question of language, is it? Because for Foucault, power operates through discourse. So what he's going to say is that the power that operates through the new discourses of sexuality, that power is actually productive. It produces something. You know, that power is not simply prohibitive. It's not this traditional kind of negative form of power that stops things. This new form of power is productive, and it produces, well, it produces the perversions. That's what he's going to argue. Okay, he gives kind of 4 points to support that argument, which I'm going to look at now. Okay, am I doing for time? Yes, I think I'm doing okay for time. The function of power then was not interdiction. This is power that is productive, that produces. So, point one then, on the surface, what appears in both cases is an effort at elimination that is always destined to fail and always constrained to begin again. In other words, this power that is directed towards sexual activities, it may appear to be a power which is trying to stop those sexual activities or constrain them. But Foucault says it's not really the effect of elimination, which is the essential point here. The earlier kind of power which works through prohibition, that would attempt to reach its objective through a decrease of the thing that it condemned. Okay, that's straightforward. That's what we assume power is doing. Whereas the control of infantile sexuality hoped to reach it through a simultaneous propagation of its own power and of the object on which it was brought to bear. That's what I want to explain. More recent forms of control, in other words, this is what Foucault is saying, more recent forms of control have a paradoxical nature. The very thing supposed to be prevented, be it perversion or sexuality itself, is constituted in the very measures purportedly directed against it. That is, where the earlier forms of prohibition of sexual behavior tried to stop banned forms of behavior where they appeared, the more modern form of control interferes to produce sexuality in order to control it, even if it presents itself as combating something that exists independently of it. Okay, that's the essential point. So I'll say this again, that Foucault is contrasting this new form of power, which is productive, with traditional power that we all understand. Traditional power tries to kind of stop things, prohibit them. He's saying, well, the kind of power involved here, power that's involved in the proliferation of discourses on sex, that is a new kind of power. It's productive power. So he makes the contrast in this way. I'll just say this again. More recent forms of control have a paradoxical nature. The very thing supposed to be prevented, be it perversion or sexuality itself, is constituted in the very measures purportedly directed against it. That's the way modern power works. That is, where the earlier forms of prohibition of sexual behavior tried to stop banned forms of behavior where they appeared, the more modern form of control interferes to produce sexuality in order to control it, even if it presents itself as combating something that exists independently of it. So this is what Foucault is saying. So let me try and give you that in his words, if I can. Yeah, here we are. This is on page 41, towards the foot of page 41 in History of Sexuality. He's contrasting these two different kinds of power. He says it's clear that we're not dealing with one and the same power mechanism, not only because in the one case it is a question of law and penalty, and in the other it's a question of medicine and regimentation, but also because the tactics employed are not the same. On the surface, what appears in both cases is an effort at elimination that was always destined to fail and always constrained to begin again. In other words, if you try and control infantile sexuality, that is destined to failure. It's basically not going to work. But there's a difference between the traditional form of power, which is really trying to kind of stop this thing, although it's failing to do so, and the modern form of power, which interferes precisely in order to produce the sexuality which it is claiming to control. Okay, I'm going to go on with Foucault's words here. The prohibition of incest's attempt to reach its objective through an asymptotic decrease in the thing it condemned, whereas the control of infantile sexuality hoped to reach it through a simultaneous propagation of its own power and of the object on which it was brought to bear. Educators and doctors combated children's onanism like an epidemic that needed to be eradicated. What this actually entailed throughout this whole secular campaign that mobilized the adult world around the sex of children was using these tenuous pleasures as a prop, constituting them as secrets, that is, forcing them into hiding so as to make possible their discovery, tracing them back to their source, tracking them from their origins to their effects, searching out everything that might cause them or simply enable them to exist. Wherever there was a chance they might appear, devices of surveillance were installed, traps were laid for compelling admissions, inexhaustible and corrective discourses were imposed, parents and teachers were alerted, and left with the suspicion that all children were guilty, and with the fear of being themselves at fault if their suspicions were not sufficiently strong. They were kept in readiness in face of this recurrent danger. Their conduct was prescribed and their pedagogy recodified. An entire medico-sexual regime took hold of the family milieu. The child's vice was not so much an enemy as a support. It may have been designated as the evil to be eliminated, but the extraordinary effort that went into the task that was bound to fail leads one to suspect that what was demanded of it was to persevere, to proliferate to the limits of the visible and the invisible, rather than to disappear for good. Always relying on this support, power advanced, multiplied its relays and effects, while its target expanded, subdivided, and branched out, penetrating further into reality at the same place. Okay, that gives us some idea of how he sees this working, this idea of power as productive. I mean, power is actually pretending that it's kind of aimed at stopping the phenomena in question, but that power actually produces, it's really aimed at producing the phenomena in order to control it. So that's the first point. I also want to look at the second point, because that brings me up to the really what is the center, I think, of Foucault's argument here. So the proliferation of discourse, he's saying, actually produces the perversions, because it's this new kind of power, and it actually produces the perversions. It's an implantation of perversion. Okay, let me go on to the second point he makes. He goes on, this new persecution of peripheral sexualities, actually, while I think about it, this is in the course textbook. Let me give you the page in case you, I think, yeah, this is on page 49 in the course textbook. I gave this paragraph, yeah, on page 49 in the course textbook. This is on the right-hand side of page 49. It's on page 42 in the book History of Sexuality. The new persecution of peripheral sexualities entailed an incorporation of perversions and a new specification of individuals. As defined by the ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical subject of them. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, in addition to being a type of life, a life form, a morphology, with an indiscrete anatomy and possibly a mysterious physiology. Nothing that went into his total composition was unaffected by his sexuality. It was everywhere present in him, at the root of all his actions, because it was their insidious and indefinitely active principle, written immodestly on his face and body, because it was a secret that always gave itself away. It was consubstantial with him, less as a habitual sin than as a singular nature. We must not forget that the psychological, psychiatric, medical category of homosexuality was constituted from the moment it was characterized by Westphal in 1870, less by a type of sexual relations than by a certain quality of sexual sensibility, a certain way of inverting the masculine and feminine in oneself. Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy into a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphrodism of the soul. The sodomites had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So this is what happens at the end of the 19th century as a result of this proliferation of discourse. Rather than merely categorizing acts as the earlier codes had, the new form of control categorizes individuals themselves according to their acts. That is, it categorizes them as various types of perverse. Okay, so homosexuality is understood now not as a punishable act someone has done, but as a matter of someone's very nature of who they are. Everything the homosexual man does is understood to be discernibly gay, in quotes, as we would say today, and his sexuality is thought to be obvious from his most mundane acts. In other words, in Foucault's words, the homosexual is now a species. Okay, and Foucault emphasizes that the machinery of power that focuses on this whole alien strain, namely the race of perverts, did not aim to suppress it, but rather to give it an analytical, visible, and permanent reality. It was implanted in bodies. That is Foucault's language. So this is on the top of page 44 in History of Sexuality. He talks about the sexologists here, actually at the foot of 43, all those minor perverts whom 19th century psychiatrists entomologized by giving them strange baptismal names, Krafft-Ebing's zoophiles, zoorists, and so on. These fine names for heresies referred to a nature that was overlooked by the law, but not so neglectful of itself that it did not go on producing more species, even when there was no order to fit them into. The machinery of power that focused on this whole alien strain did not aim to suppress it, but rather to give it an analytical, visible, and permanent reality. It was implanted in bodies. So this is what he means by the implantation of perversions. It's a form of power which operates through the new discourses on sexuality, and that power implants perversion in bodies, he says. Okay, I think it's, am I doing the time now? It's 4:30, so I think on that particular section, I'll be able to stop there because otherwise I won't get to the end. That's from the implantation, that's from the perverse implantation. So you have this explosion of discourses on sexuality, but it's not just an explosion of discourses. A new kind of power operates through these discourses, and this new kind of power produces this new alien race, as Foucault puts it, in other words, the race of the perverts. Okay. I'm just going to go briefly to the next chapter, Scientia Sexualis, and then I think I'll have to start concluding this. Actually, there is one thing I want to say. As it's 4:30, I'm going to say something about Freud at this point, because just to make sure that I don't run out of time before I've said it. If you go to page 49, which is where that last quotation is found, the quotation about the peripheral sexualities from History of Sexuality, the new persecution of peripheral sexualities entailed an incorporation of perversions and a new specification of individuals. And then he concludes that paragraph by saying, the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. In other words, the homosexual was a particular type of person, and everything about the being of that person spoke their sexuality. The homosexual as a species. What I want to say about Freud, I mean, directly underneath that quote from History of Sexuality on page 49, I've put a quotation from Freud, which is from the 3 essays. where Freud's talking about homosexuality, and this is what he says. So I hope you've all got that on page 49, on the right-hand side at the top, just below the quote from Foucault. Freud says this: psychoanalytic research is most decidedly opposed to any attempt at separating off homosexuals from the rest of mankind as a group of special character. Okay, so in other words, what that means is that psychoanalysis is opposed to this idea that the homosexual is a species, you see, because the idea that the homosexual is a species precisely is the idea that the homosexual is a particular type of person that is separate from the normal type of person. So, in other words, Freud rejects that whole way of thinking. So, you see, Foucault is talking about sexology, the new language of sexuality, which defines the way we think about sexuality now. And that comes with this kind of approach that in this new language, you are categorized as a person. You know, you are a homosexual, or you are a masochist, or you are whatever it might be. And these categories characterize you in your being. That's the idea. But that is sexology, if you like. But Freud rejects the principle on which that is based. He says that psychoanalytic research is most decidedly opposed to any attempt at separating off homosexuals from the rest of mankind as a group of a special character. He goes on. It has found that all human beings are capable of making a homosexual object choice, and in fact have made one in their unconscious, you see. So this is Freud. Homosexuals are not a particular group of people who have these same-sex desires, whereas we normal people don't have them. On the contrary, you know, everyone has desires that go in every direction. You know, people have desires for members of the opposite sex and desires for members of the same sex. All human beings are capable of making a homosexual object choice and have in fact made one in their unconscious. And then he goes on, from the point of view of psychoanalysis, the exclusive sexual interest felt by men for women is also a problem that needs elucidating and is not a self-evident fact based upon an attraction that is ultimately of a chemical nature. In other words, heterosexual attraction needs explanation just as much as homosexual attraction, you see. So this is Freud. So again, what I would do is link it back to what I was saying yesterday. The conclusion at the end of the first half yesterday, when we were looking at History of Madness, the conclusion was that psychoanalysis is an antidote to psychiatry. Now, that was what I said at the end yesterday. And I based this on what Foucault says about, you know, the point of the modern period is that madness is excluded from humanity. So reason there's no communication between reason and madness in the modern period. But then at the end of the 19th century, Freud recreates the possibility of a dialogue between reason and unreason, you know, within the psychoanalytic situation. So in that way, psychoanalysis is the kind of antidote to psychiatry. Psychiatry is a reason kind of in monologue with itself. But I come back to the same point here, you see. If we're looking at the sciences of sexuality, which is what Foucault is focused on, then psychoanalysis is actually an antidote to that, because the sciences of sexuality are based on categorizing individuals. You know, you are homosexual or heterosexual, or you are a masochist or a sadist or whatever it is, and that kind of defines you in your being. And that is the way that Krafft-Ebing, for example, would have thought of it, I think. But Freud doesn't think of it in that way. There's something actually very different in Freud. So again, Freud stands out as a kind of antidote to that kind of thinking. Okay, that's an important point, I think. I wanted to make that point so that you know, I don't just run out of time and forget it. Okay, it's right. We've got about 20 minutes left now. What I need to do, first of all, going into the next chapter, which is the Scientia Sexualis, the important point in that chapter, important point in that chapter is, I think I've got this in the section on page 41 in the course booklet. On page 41 in the course booklet, I've given you part of the conclusion of the chapter on Scientia Sexualis. So I'm missing out the earlier parts of the chapter, but I'm coming up to the conclusion because time is getting a bit short. So I'm going to read this quotation on page 41, which is from 67 and 68 in History of Sexuality. Foucault says, let us consider things in broad historical perspective. Breaking with the traditions of ars erotica, our society has equipped itself with a scientia sexualis. To be more precise, it has pursued the task of producing true discourses concerning sex, and this by adapting, not without difficulty, the ancient procedure of confession to the rules of scientific discourse. That essentially is his argument. He sees confession as a kind of important shift in Western culture, as we were saying earlier. But the way he sees confession is about transforming sex into discourse. That's how he sees confession. And then he sees those discourses about sex moving out from the religious context into various secular contexts, pornography, the administrative discourses about population, medicine, pedagogy, jurisprudence, and so on. All these official discourses about sex and start to spring up. But at the end of the 19th century, he sees the Scientia Sexualis coming about when this original impulse to confession joins together with the scientific procedure of investigating sexuality. It's when those two things come together at the end of the 19th century, Foucault says, that's when the Scientia Sexualis comes about. This is what he's saying on this page. Let me try and get this. So our society, he's saying, has pursued the task of producing true discourses concerning sex, and this by adapting, not without difficulty, the ancient procedure of confession to the rules of scientific discourse. I mean, this makes perfect sense, what he's saying. I mean, you think about Krafft-Ebing, for example. I mean, Krafft-Ebing was a psychiatrist. He was quite humane by all accounts. And he would argue, I think, in the courts as a legal expert, that perversions should be understood as a kind of variation of the human sexual response, should not be seen as necessarily kind of evil. And he started collecting material on the variety of human sexuality, the kind of weird variations of sexual desire that people display. And he published this in his book called Psychopathia Sexualis, the Psychopathology of Sex. And so the Psychopathology of Sex had lots of case histories. In other words, there were people describing their own experiences, you know, what made them aroused, you know, some cases very weird things. Some of these cases came from the courts, but others were not cases that had led to any kind of legal prosecution. They were just people describing their kind of unusual erotic responses to things, and these were published. And so what Krafft-Ebing did, because he was a doctor, of course, he called the book Psychopathia Sexualis. It was done in Latin because that meant nobody would understand what it's about. So that's fine. And in the case histories themselves, the juicier bits in the case histories were all put in Latin, I believe, because that meant only doctors would be able to, doctors or scientists would be able to kind of read this. And then the book was published, Psychopathia Sexualis. And then the result of this in Vienna was that there was a huge increase in the demand for Latin classes so that people could learn Latin, basically. And so everybody was kind of reading it. And then people, having read the first edition, they sent their own experiences in. If they recognized something, they would send their own experiences in to Krafft-Ebing. And then the second edition of Psychopathia Sexualis was about 5 times bigger than the first edition, and so on and on. So this is what Foucault is actually talking about. You see, this is related to confession, isn't it? You're confessing some kind of intimate detail to, in this case, the doctor, Krafft-Ebing, who is kind of fairly humane person. So it's got that element of confession, but it's got that element of confession combined with the element of scientific investigation, because Krafft-Ebing is interested in trying to understand scientifically the variety of human sexual responses. So this is what Foucault is saying, and he's quite right. You see, you can see the beginning of the sciences of sexuality in this way. It's you've adapted the ancient procedure of confession to the rules of scientific discourse. I mean, that's literally the case. Okay, let me go on a little bit further. But what he adds to this, and this is the particular Foucauldian aspect. I'm going down to the first new paragraph. Further down on the left of 41, he says, sexuality, in quotation marks, the correlative of that slowly developed discursive practice which constitutes the scientia sexualis. So this is the key idea of the book, that sexuality should not be regarded as a kind of biological fact or some kind of natural force. Sexuality, again in quotation marks, is the correlative of that slowly developed discursive practice that constitutes the scientia sexualis. In other words, sexuality as we understand it, as we experience it, is the result of that practice occurring at the end of the 19th century of people confessing to doctors their sexual peculiarities, and then doctors classifying them and understanding them in various ways. That's a discursive practice. And what we understand and experience as sexuality is a product of that discursive practice. So this is what Foucault is saying. So the this is really the key point in the book. So what he wants to say is that sexuality as we experience it now in the contemporary West can, strictly speaking, be traced back to the end of the 19th century, which is when the scientia sexualis emerges. But he's given more of a historical account of how we reached that point. He's saying, it goes back to the Council of Trent and the new rules for confession. And in a way, it goes further back than that. You can take it right back to the 12th century or something, when the process of confession starts to get going. There's something in Western culture which is it's the impulse to transform sexuality into discourse. And that's what finally leads to our sciences of sexuality. But Foucault wants to say this is how we should see sexuality. Just very briefly, I know I'm running out of time now, aren't I? Just very briefly, let me give you a couple of quotes from some of the later sections of the book. This is on page 49 in the course booklet. So this is from the second half of the book, the more heavily theoretical part. This is where he kind of defines what he means by sexuality. Page 49 on the left-hand side. It's from page 103 in History of Sexuality. Sexuality must not be described as a stubborn drive, by nature alien and of necessity disobedient to a power which exhausts itself trying to subdue it and often fails to control it entirely. It appears rather, sexuality that is, appears rather as an especially dense transfer point for relations of power between men and women, young people and old people, parents and offspring, teachers and students, priests and laity, and administration of the population. Sexuality is not the most intractable element in power relations, but rather one of those endowed with the greatest instrumentality, useful for the greatest number of maneuvers, and capable of serving as a point of support, as a linchpin for the most varied strategies. But what he's talking about here, when he talks about sexuality as an especially dense transfer point for relations of power, he's talking about the discourse, isn't he? Because that's the way he sees discourse. Power operates through discourse. That's the way Foucault sees it. And the discourse of sexuality is particularly fruitful for the operation of power, he's going to say. Coming back to the point we making earlier in relation to discipline and punish, we define our sexuality now in terms of all these categories that our sexologists produced, and this is part of the kind of this is part of the apparatus that we use to kind of for our own kind of self-surveillance. We're always kind of surveying ourselves and fitting ourselves into different categories. Okay, and this is our modern experience of sexuality. So, I mean, the essence of our modern experience of sexuality is that we see ourselves, for example, essentially as, I am heterosexual or I am homosexual, and that we feel that we are defined by those terms. But Foucault is saying that is something new that only stems from the end of the 19th century. So that is a relatively recent phenomenon, and ultimately, sexuality in that sense is a historical construct. And this is what he says in, again, page 49 further down. He's saying, in the middle of that paragraph lower down, he says, sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given, which power tries to hold in check, or as an obscure domain which knowledge tries gradually to uncover. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct, not a furtive reality that is difficult to grasp, but a great surface network in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances are linked to one another in accordance with a few major strategies of knowledge and power. So it's sexuality is a what does he say there? It's should not be thought of as a natural given. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct. Well, I mean, historical construct is a bit vague, isn't it? But so you go back to the original text and you try to find out, what did they translate as historical construct? But I think the French word is just dispositif, which is no help at all. What does that really mean? Well, so what he's saying in the end is that sexuality, the way we experience sexuality is inevitably social, which means that it relates to a particular culture at a particular time. I think that's what he's saying, and I think that is right, and that is an enormous contribution to our understanding. Okay, I haven't got time to go much further, so what I would just like to do briefly, just to finish off, just to try and give it a little bit of a conclusion. If you go to pages 65, 66, if I'm in the right, no, or no, maybe 63 or 64. This is from the book by Chloe Taylor. She's talking about the later volumes of the history of sexuality. What he does in the later volumes is that he explores sexuality in the world of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. And this follows directly on from what I've just said, because if the way we experience sexuality is social, which means that our experience of sexuality is the product of a particular time, a particular culture in which we exist, then we should find that the ancient Greeks, who lived in a completely different cultural world to us, we should be able to find that their experience of sexuality was quite different to ours, and similarly the ancient Romans. And this is what Foucault is exploring in the second and the third volumes of the history of sexuality. And this is what he finds, for example, I mean, on the issue of homosexuality. Again, he's going to say there's no such thing as homosexuality in the Greek world. Though homosexuality is a concept that was created in 1870. It's part of our kind of cultural way of experiencing ourselves, which was created then. There's no such thing as homosexuality in the Greek world. They have a completely different experience of sexuality. And this is what he's exploring there. And again, this seems to me to be quite right, because I mean, what he says about the Greeks is that, you know, they are like us in that certain things about sexuality seem to them to be quite wrong, and other things seem to be definitely okay, just as for us. Whereas for us, the important thing is, you know, are you heterosexual or are you homosexual? That implies that the most important thing is what is the sex of the people you're attracted to? Are you attracted to people of the opposite sex, or are you attracted to people of the same sex? That for us seems to define us, seems to be the most important thing. But for the Greeks, that wasn't the case. I mean, for the Greeks, for example, with Plato, you have the idea that desire is stimulated by beauty. You know, desire is stimulated by beauty. And so the beauty that stimulates your desire could be the beauty of a person of the same sex as you, or the beauty of a person who is the opposite sex of you, to you. I mean, for the Greeks, that's not a fundamental issue. You know, desire is stimulated by beauty. The sex of the beautiful person is not a fundamental issue. But there are fundamental issues for the Greeks. And the way Foucault describes it is that what's most important for the Greeks is the idea of self-mastery, that if you are a slave to your desires, that is not good. You know, what you have to be is you have to be in control of your own desires. That's the key thing for them. And that's what kind of defines you, to be in control of your own desires, not to be a slave to your own desires. So they do genuinely have a different experience of sexuality to us. Okay, I'm going to have to stop in 2 minutes, so I will I'm going to finish with one thought and then maybe try and answer a question. The thought I want to finish with is that in Foucault's explorations of the Greeks and their way of understanding their experience, he comes up with a very interesting notion. Let's see if I can find it here, and in Chloe Taylor. Yeah, this is what I've just been talking about is all kind of explained on pages 61 and 62, by the way. I think Chloe Taylor does this all quite well. It's all there. Yeah. he comes up with this notion. I can't find this now on this page. I'm just going to tell you what it is. In volumes 2 and 3 of A History of Sexuality, in his kind of attempts to understand Greek culture in its own terms, he comes up with this notion of practices of the self, that the Greeks had this notion of it's related to the idea of self-mastery, but it's kind of broader than this notion of self-mastery. So they had an idea of kind of practices of the self by which you kind of develop your kind of life and experience within their cultural context. So practices of the self becomes an important idea in Foucault's later work. And the key point there is that this is practices of the self. It's something you actually do, like exercises on the self, which develop your capacities. So just bringing this back to psychoanalysis again, what I want to say to Foucault is, well, yes, I think you're right about that, but rather than seeing psychoanalysis as a science of sexuality, which I think kind of misses what psychoanalysis is, I mean, Freud, as we said, is really the antidote to all that. Psychoanalysis will be better understood as a practice of the self, in the way Foucault describes practices of the self in volume 2 and 3 of the history of sexuality. Okay, I'm going to have to stop there because we're coming up to 5 o'clock. Just one question. Let me see if I can very briefly respond. Can we assume that Foucault ignores the possibility of an innate desire for love and children? Are his thoughts ethically dangerous as he ignores other natural motivators for sexual desire? Again, I think say, does he ignore the possibility of an innate desire for love and children? He doesn't ignore the possibility of an innate desire for love and children, I don't think. I wouldn't say he does that. That seems rather a strange objection to make to Foucault, really, given that we know that Foucault was gay. But no, I don't think he ignores. I don't think he ignores those things. I mean, his focus is on the way we understand sexuality, and I think the way I want to respond to that is just to come back to Freud again. Actually, one of the most important things with Freud, I think, Freud's radical new ways of thinking about sexuality, is that Freud breaks the link between sexuality and reproduction. That rather than seeing sexuality as being essentially about reproduction, Freud underlines the fact that human sexuality is much broader than that. And that seems to be one of the important things about Freud. Yeah. Okay, it's 2 minutes past 5 now. I think I'm going to have to stop at that point. I'm sorry I could go on. There's so much more to say, but maybe next year, if I do another course on this, I'll try and say more. So I hope you've enjoyed it. You found it useful. And I hope I managed to say some interesting things about Foucault and about his relation to Freud. I'll be doing a course. My next course, I think, is in October. In mid-October, I'm talking about psychoanalysis and art. And then later than that, mid-September, I'm talking about psychoanalysis and art. And mid-October, I'm talking about psychoanalysis and Marxism. So I would hope if those of you who found the course interesting, perhaps I'll see you again then. But in the meantime, I mean, have a great summer, everyone. And I hope to see some of you in the autumn.